Hey everyone, it's Brad and Josh here, and we welcome you to We'll Bring the Popcorn, the ultimate film and TV podcast. But I'm going to move us into our film review of this week, which is A Smashing Machine. So this is the story of Mark Kerr. It takes place during, kind of gets the most significant part of his career, which was 97 to 2000. So this is where the UFC and pride fighting were kind of really starting to take off a little bit. I do kind of start off from the beginning of this is that it's kind of weird how it was marketed because it mentions UFC multiple times in it, but the majority of this film is about his time in Pride, which is in Japan, two totally different organizations, even though the people who owned UFC ended up buying Pride and kind of dissolving it, and things around 2007 that happened. But it was kind of weird the marketing about UFC, even though he did have a significant, two event run with UFC 14 and 15 where he won the championships there. UFC had very little to do with this. It was all about Pride.
Right.
But yeah, this is 97 to 2000 of his life. It revolves around him going to Pride because he was getting bigger paychecks and becoming a big star over there to the Japanese people, but also deals significantly with his relationship with his girlfriend, Dawn, who's played by Emily Blunt, who did a fantastic job in it. But this was a very interesting film that I have to say is Dwayne Johnson's best acting performance that he's done so far. Like, from putting on the prosthetics, sometimes prosthetics look like he was a different person. Yeah. Especially there's one where he's wearing a beanie and he's working out and his face just did not look anywhere near like Dwayne Johnson anymore. And other times it still looked like significantly. You're not going to be able to change him that much, but I think he did a fantastic job showing us a different side of a dramatic, of a sad, of a addicted guy, because he gets addicted to painkillers heavily and he struggles with his addiction. And I think Dwayne played it really well.
Yeah, I think you did too. And if you're a big MMA fan, you know how important fighters like Mark Coleman and Mark Kerr were to like the early days of MMA and kind of helping break down some of that stigma of it's just a bunch of guys bar fighting, like we're trying to do like this over the top violence. Because if you don't remember the early days of UFC, like it was very, very controversial. There was talk of them being banned in the U.S. because of the violence and the brutality, and it was only available on pay-per-view, and we're obviously, as a society, much more desensitized to a lot of that now. Mm-hmm. And the UFC is so mainstream popular now, like it's everywhere. You can turn on some sports channels practically any night of the week, especially on the weekends, and you can see different MMA organizations on TV. But the story of Mark Kerr is such a fascinating one because he was one of those early pioneers of MMA that, he dealt with the addiction and the personal struggles that he goes through. And, The Rock does a fantastic job of portraying that here. And they do pay a lot of respect to this time frame in his career and his mindset and how it was affecting himself personally. I thought he did a really good job of bringing that drama to this. Like, it was definitely his best role. There was some things, just knowing the history of the UFC, that it felt kind of like it has to be sensationalized a little bit for the sake of making a movie, but I think they did a fine job in telling his story too. And I love, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the very ending of the film, at least, where they have the quick shot of Mark Kerr, where it's just an instant shot to the real Mark Kerr and kind of paying the respect to him at the very end of the film, which I thought was a really nice touch.
It was also strange.
It was a strange cut, but it was a nice touch too. Yeah. Like, I don't know how I feel about it, but literally at the end of the movie, they just show Mark Kerr in a grocery store for some reason, and we're like, hey, this is him. Like, he's a pioneer of MMA or whatever, and just kind of paid that respect. But overall, a really, really solid film. I would say that Emily Blunt's probably my favorite part of it because she plays such this interesting, complex, emotional character in Dawn, his girlfriend. I thought she did a fantastic job.
She had to be all over the place with that because Dawn has her addictions and her struggles as well, but there's such a weird, crazy dynamic with the relationship because she's there for Mark, but when Mark's in fighting mode, he doesn't want to be bothered, and when he's drugged up, he's acting significantly different, so she's having to take care of him, but then he finally gets himself clean, and she doesn't know how to act anymore. Like, I kind of went back to where I have to take care of him now. I don't know how to be me. She's going out drinking and partying with her friends because Mark is, sober and not touching anything to make sure he doesn't go back to doing that. So there's her emotional state is just all over the place for this entire film, because there's moments where you feel sympathetic to her because Mark is kind of being a jerk to her and not treating her correctly. And then you get a scene where she's abusing him and mistreating him and telling him off for minor things and not listening. And there's just it's such a toxic,
very
just kind of insane type of relationship that they had. Like, it was just so all over the place. And like, I enjoyed the dynamic they had between each other. One of my favorites, it's one of the smallest kind of ridiculous scenes, but they go to a fair and she's trying to get Mark to go on the spaceship that spins, your centrifuge spins in a circle and it pins you to the wall and stuff. But you get to see this guy, because Mark Kerr was a giant of a man. He was ripped in his prime time, and The Rock has always been, and like, this is probably one of the, he's bulked up a lot for stuff, but this is one where I say he's probably the most physical fit that he was ever been, like lean fighter kind of cut, look to him and stuff, which matched Kerr very well. But it's funny to see a guy of his size and significance be scared of wanting to go on a carnival ride. And I don't know, it was his acting and Emily's acting. It was just something about that, just realness and rawness of that, and seeing a guy that big be scared of going on something that just made it like really humorous. But you also got to see some light and levity with, Dawn, because she's kind of enjoying herself inside there, even though, he's standing outside waiting for her because he's too scared to get on it. And just like asking the guy, can I stand in the center? Is that where? No, you can't stand in the center.
That's a liability. And then they do an immediate cut to him riding on the carousel. And he's like, yeah, this is more my speed. Which is so funny.
Again, The Rock is what, 6'5"?
He's not a small man.
Riding
and he's just riding a
carousel
horse. It's funny. The optics of it are hilarious. But one of the things they do touch on that I really appreciate is like the fighters' mentality about how they approach like fighting and stuff. Like, a lot of times a lot of these fights are sensationalized to make it appear like these two fighters just hate each other's guts, because you got to sell a fight. It's all about getting eyes, getting pay-per-view buys, getting people in the seats. Like, so a lot of these rivalries just have to be kind of manufactured, and they kind of talk about that, but they really dive into his mentality of, I've never lost a fight. How do you handle it? And they really do a good job of portraying that, especially when he's like being interviewed by the Japanese media, where they're like, well, what would you do if you lost? And you see that mentality that he has, that a lot of these fighters have, is just like, well, I'm not losing. I haven't even put any thought into it because it's not a possibility. I'm too good of a fighter. I don't think about losing, which fair, right? Like, you don't need to go in with an expectation you're going to lose and how you would handle it. And he just couldn't bring himself to answer it. And then he loses a fight, and you see him just lose himself in his, confidence. Like, his confidence is shattered. He's like almost panicking, really, because he doesn't know how to handle like losing a fight. And they do a really good job of like showing that throughout this film, because this isn't your typical like guy just goes through and mows down a bunch of people. Like, if you know anything about Mark Kerr's career, his win-loss record is terrible. Like, he's only won a few more fights than he lost in his career, and he started out like 14-0, I want to say, or pretty close to that.
Yeah. By
the time he finished fighting, like, he ended his career on like a several fight losing streak, which obviously for this, there's no need to go into that, but you really talk about that breakdown of mentality that he had from losing and what that did to him personally and how it affected him. Like, I think they really did a good job of exploring that in this film, that, is a very real part of what these guys go through when they're fighters like this, especially when you're this up-and-coming fighter who's being billed as, a new megastar who's an unbeatable fighting machine. Like, how does that affect you when you lose? Because there's very few fighters in the history of fighting that retire undefeated.
Yep.
Very, very few. And the ones that do are extremely special, upper echelon type fighters. And this talks about the very real reality that these guys who, this is what they do, this is what they know, and how do they handle losing, and how do they bounce back from it. And I think they did a good job of exploring that here.
Yeah, I liked how they showed you the kind of realness and rawness of the behind the scenes, because a lot of the movie does deal with his painkiller addiction, but it's also touching on the real fact of what these guys put their bodies through. Like I believe the UFC started without gloves. It was like bare knuckle, wasn't it? Or at least just wrapped.
Pretty
It
close,
didn't have
yeah.
the padded gloves until later, and they started increasing the padding
It got a
and
lot
stuff
safer.
too. But they were getting kneed on top of the head and the back of the neck, which can cause brain damage and other stuff with that. And you just see how bloodied and beaten that he gets after, and you get all the doctor visits, and you can see why a lot of athletes like that can get addicted to drugs or painkillers and stuff like that, because they're destroying their bodies. They're putting so much damage. And I did like keeping the touches of the cauliflower ears and other stuff that you see with the UFC fighters, which is a very real, thing that they deal with. But I did like that, because it's how does what happens after the fight affect the person? How does it affect the relationship? How does it affect them mentally and physically? And they really touch on that in a good way. And going back to Dwayne Johnson, like I was really impressed by what he did here, because it wasn't only just putting on the prosthetics. He's still kind of doing an action-esque centered character, doing UFC fighter, but it's the way he held his body differently than he normally walks and everything else. Like, he's trying to feel different, and the subtle softness that he gave to his voice. So it's him, but it's still a little bit differently, and just the emotion that he was able to do. And I'll even give some love to the makeup people for the prosthetics, but also we know The Rock is covered in tattoos, and you have sequences where he's drenched in sweat and has bruising and cuts on his body and stuff, and it looked fantastic. Like, not only to be able to have to cover up all of his tattoos and everything else, is to be able to add on that realistic bruising and damage that you get after a fight. Like, it all looked really, really solid there.
Yeah, they did a fantastic job of making it look like he never had any of those things to begin with. Like, it was really well done, and a fantastic job of that. Like I said, I really like how they just dove into the realities of what these guys go through. Like, the UFC was notorious for being very unsafe and raw and violent, and I think that was the original appeal. But as time went on and as MMA became significantly more popular, it had to become regulated. You know what I mean? Just to have, if they wanted it to be commercially successful like it has been, you have to implement these things. And they had a really funny press conference. It just makes me laugh, because now these things are all in place, but you go back to like the Pride press conference that they have, where they're talking about these new rules that they're implementing and things that you can't do. That's kind of standard now, but this is how they had to approach it, because they literally say, and it's so silly now because you wouldn't think about it now if you've watched it for any amount of time, but they were like, no more biting, no more eye gouging, no more any of this stuff that,
because there's almost no rules.
like, you would think would be like, well, duh, you don't, like, it's a sported contest. You'd think these things. It wasn't. It wasn't something that people were thinking of back then, because it was literally like there were no such thing as weight classes. You had 160-pound guys fighting 300-pound guys. Like, the UFC at the very beginning is wild. If you get a chance to watch some of the older footage, like, it's night and day compared to what it is now. And you have your weight classes and your rules and your types of gloves that you use, which still vary based on the promotion you work for too. Not everybody uses the same size like gloves and protections. You still have companies like bare knuckle fighting that don't have gloves, that just tape up your fists, and it's still bare knuckle like boxing and types of things like that.
Which I didn't realize was still going. Like, I was actually watching a volleyball tournament that was going on this weekend, because I got a family member who plays in it. And before that came on was Paige Van Zandt, bare knuckle boxing. I'm like, that's still a thing. I thought in this day and age, like, that wouldn't be allowed, but
It's still a thing.
There was a former UFC person, bare knuckle boxing.
And there's a few of them that are in that organization too. And then you have others like pro fighting leagues and all that other stuff. Like, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it now, and it's a really cool look at the early days of MMA and how far it's come if you're a fan of the sport like I am. And just, it's really cool to see like the origin days of it and the early onset popularity of it. I love the interaction in the hospital at the beginning between him and the older lady, like, or at the doctor's office, and the kid, and he was just that she's asking him the questions that people were asking at the time, do you guys really hate each other? And he's like, no, we really don't hate each other. Or, it's like, is that thing they're trying to get banned? Like, it was a very real thing back in the day, because there was a lot of people that were like, it's too barbaric, it's too graphic. You can't show this on television, which, look at how far we've come now. It's like one of the biggest sporting companies in the world now, making hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and billions in some cases. But it's a fun look at the early onset days of MMA, and it was really well done. I really like, the way everything was presented. It felt darker, it felt grittier. Like, it wasn't super glossy in terms of the way it was shot. Like, I really appreciate that it felt the aesthetic of the time that it was happening. So a really well shot movie.
Yeah, and as I mentioned early on, like when I talked about, they kind of hyped this up as a UFC movie, but it was a Pride movie because, UFC is known for the octagon, and Pride is basically using boxing rings for everything still. So I think some could go into it expecting it to be a UFC movie, kind of like The Warrior was, which is another fantastic, MMA film. But I also did like another behind the scenes was that they kind of explained to the audience a little bit more, because at that time it needed explained with the press of what exactly is this? This is MMA. It's like, well, Mark Kerr was a wrestler, but you have guys over here that could be karate, that could be jiu-jitsu. Like everybody is coming from a different discipline. So the fights can be so much, more significant and different. And you also have, like, they've talked with Mark Coleman, who was kind of a wrestler as well, but he changed to be more of almost like a boxer. So he mixed in a lot more boxing with, his fighting and everything. So it kind of went into the explanation, because when you think of MMA, like, well, what exactly are they doing? Are they all doing the same movesets? Do they all study the same, martial art form or something else? But this showed, especially early on, probably more of these days, a lot of them do a similar type of training and martial arts training and stuff with it. But back then it was pretty significant difference between how many wrestlers you had, and grapplers and wrestlers you had in there, compared to the straight martial artists that were in there. And I like that they touched on that aspect.
Yeah, and it's a definitely an important dynamic when it comes to fighting. And you have guys that come from certain backgrounds that fighters nowadays are much more trained to be more well-rounded. Mm-hmm. You still have things that certain people are significantly better at. You've got guys that are just one punch can knock you out kind of thing. And they do kind of explore that, like you said, where there was a push, especially from the UFC on their end, to make it more commercially appealing, was to not have guys just take you down and lay on you for five rounds and you win because you outpointed the guy. They wanted the more dynamic finishes where they wanted to see people getting knocked out. They wanted submissions. They wanted like highlight reel fights to get people hyped and excited for the promotion. And that's kind of where Mark Coleman became a little bit of a pioneer in that, where he was more of the wrestler turned striker. And I want to give a little bit of credit here to Ryan Bader, who is a famous UFC fighter, was in, the UFC for a long time, Bellator heavyweight champion at one point, plays Mark Coleman in here, which is, it's so funny for me to turn my brain off seeing Ryan Bader play Mark Coleman, because he looks nothing like Mark Coleman. If you look at Mark Coleman, like, they could not be more diametrically opposed in how they look physically, but he does a fine job of playing Mark Coleman here, and given that he's not really an actor, but he lends that MMA, those credentials to this film, because he has been a successful UFC fighter. Like, having him play a role like this significantly in it kind of helps lend that credibility that you're looking for. And I think he did a fine job in it. I know he's not the most seasoned actor. He's only been in a couple things, but I think he did a fine job playing his, best friend Mark Coleman in this.
Yeah, I agree. I think he did a really good job in it, because you kind of felt like this is kind of how some fighters are going to act. This is how they're going to be, that he might be being told something really significant, like when Don calls him freaked out over one of the big turning points in the film. And he's like, okay, all right, I'll be out there soon. Like, just like, almost like nothing bothers them, but it's that kind of fighter mentality that they're thinking and they're planning and they're going after it. Like, it's not a fight or flight type of reaction from him. And I think he handled himself really well, but there was quite a few other like cameos by some other fighters. You also got Boss Rutan in there, which was awesome. That was fun to see him having a role, just being himself basically through it all, which was which was nice. But I think everybody did a very good job with who they were portraying, what they were doing. Is Dwayne Johnson playing a guy who was born in Ohio, who's Irish and like Puerto Rican, with The Rock being Samoan and everything else. But I mean, he matches about as close as you. I couldn't think of who else could probably pull off the size and the look. Like the only other one is Alan Ritchson, but he's much fairer complexion than what Mark Kerr was and everything else. But they all did a fantastic job, and it was really interesting to watch the dynamics between all of them, to be able to see the behind the scenes stuff of the fighting and the dynamics between, as you said, like most everyone thinks that these fighters hate each other and have to have this mentality that they hate each other going in. And that was a moment early on, as you said, in that doctor's office, that really showed that Dwayne is doing something different with his acting and with who he's being, because it's such a big guy being so soft with this grandmother and with the grandchild and everything else, and joking with no fighting. Like, you see a guy who's here because of his last fight and getting beat up and everything. And there's even some funny moments where it's funny, but it's also sad at the same time, because after a fight in Pride, he's asking for painkillers because of it. And the guy's like, no, like, permission. And because there's a language barrier, but the Japanese guy is trying to tell him, you're not getting any of the opiates, because he just straight out, like, you got some opiates, you got this, and like,
very forward about it.
Advil. Like, oh, you want some Advil? They're just handing him out like candy, and he just takes a whole cup full of Advil and stuff. But it's funny, but at the same time, you can see that dynamic of an addict, of how he's reacting to not getting his way and not getting what he wants. And like, he's making light of it because he's mad, but he doesn't want to show that he's mad. So he's kind of belittling the guy who can't fully understand like what he's saying or doing. And that was a kind of could almost be like a throwaway little moment, but I feel like it did have a significance of looking at him and his addiction in that moment. Like, it was a funny moment, but if you look deeper at it, it's an addict struggling with not getting what he needs or wants.
Yeah, they do a good job of really portraying that, and the things that he goes through, and his journey to get clean and try to stay clean, and the ways that he struggles with that. And I think they did a really good job of portraying that, because it was a very real problem back in those days of MMA. And not to say it's not completely gone away, because there's still people that do that. And obviously there's much more stringent drug testing now than there ever was back then. Mm-hmm. Like, obviously you have, things that you can't put in your body and be able to fight now, obviously. So they do a good job of kind of towing that line back then of the very real struggles that a lot of those fighters had, that, were putting their bodies on the line for very little money compared to what they do now. Like, now these guys are, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, still not making what they probably should for putting their bodies on the line. And that's another conversation for another time. But if you're in that upper echelon of MMA fighters, you can make a very, very lucrative living off of being a fighter. And, without guys like that, without guys like Mark Kerr, that wouldn't be possible. Like, just helping really popularize the sport, not only overseas, but here. And, it's a very interesting study of, addiction and the things that these guys go through, and the mentality that you have to have as a fighter to be that successful. And it was a very, very well done and well told story, I think.
And they definitely touched on just a little bit. They didn't go too heavy with it on like what they're making to put their bodies through it, because you get him kind of trying to negotiate what his pay is, and it was like $3,000, $3,500 a fight, which isn't an extraordinary amount. You're like, how many fights a year does he have to do just to make almost basically minimum wage? Like, you think, oh, you're getting paid $3,500 for a fight. They're not fighting every single week most of the time. Like, back then they were fighting. Because I know in like UFC, when he was in UFC, I think it was July to October for 2 big events that he fought in. But if you're doing 2 fights a year at $3,500, you're not making anything. Right. So, but you got guys now who are doing a fight for $1 million purse just for that one fight, who could do, of course, like Conor McGregor, someone who became very big in the UFC, who could do basically one fight a year and be extremely comfortable and not have to fight anymore because of how much money. And they do briefly touch, especially towards the end, of just how significantly more fighters are making nowadays compared to then, because you got Kerr and those pioneers who, like, one of the big events in the movie, the main prize pool is 200,000, which is a significant amount of money, but that's chump change to what they're making now.
And that's, to be very clear, that's still the upper echelon of fighters.
It is, yes.
There's a lot of guys that are still like making their way into, guys and girls making their way into MMA that are not getting paid that. And there's another deeper conversation about pay disparity in MMA and what a lot of these guys who are fighting should be making in theory versus what they're actually making. It's still better than it was then.
Yeah.
But it's very top heavy. So the bigger stars, if you can make yourself to the point where you're a bigger star, a bigger draw, you'll make more money. But a lot of these guys that are fighting on the undercard still aren't making a significant amount of money, where they're going to have to fight multiple times a year.
Yeah, because this was all about Mark Kerr was at the kind of the top and one of the biggest fighters, and he still wasn't making much to what's compared to the big fighters now. It's just so, and you can do that with all sports, like from, you know, our favorite baseball players back in the 80s and 90s, what they were making there to what, you know, the top players or even the middle players are now. Almost the lower tier players are making more than the stars did back in the day. Like, there's been a significant jump for all of them on the top tier, and you still have some that are barely, you know, getting anything. Like, if you're in the minors in a sport, you might be getting 30,000 a year to be in the minors, while, you know, some guy you're waiting to replace is making 200 million in the majors. Like, there's a significant difference. And that's kind of what they highlighted a little bit here, is just from the top tier talent back then. I don't even want to know what the lower tier talent made in Mark Kerr's time. If he was making 3,500 a fight for a top tier talent, they paying the guys $500, if that, to go fight him.
Yeah, it's crazy, the pay disparity for sure. But they do such a good job of highlighting a lot of that in a film that is a little under 2 hours, I think is what it was. It was about a 2-hour film that, you know, it's well paced and it's well shot and well done, and I really got a lot of enjoyment out of it. Like I said, Emily Blunt was fantastic in it, as she usually is, and this is easily The Rock's best role, I think, to date as far as acting goes. Like, he's not notoriously known as the best actor in the world, but I think he took a big step up here for sure.
Yeah, so The Smashing Machine is an entertaining biography film about Mark Kerr. You're getting to see some sensualized, upped stuff with his life, but you get to see a lot of stuff he went through. And I do believe this is, as you just mentioned, this is Dwayne Johnson's best performance. Maybe we'll see some awards nominations from, I don't know, especially with the year we've had, and we just had Daniel Day-Lewis come back as well, that you're going to see him winning the awards. But I could see some of them giving him a nod because of this, because he did a really good job. Emily Blunt could also get nominated for her role playing this toxic, crazy, kind of over the top, on and off girlfriend of his. But I think everyone did a really good job. It has a few issues that we didn't really, poke too much at. My main thing was the very ending, which was a weird kind of wall-breaking ending that they did at the end that just kind of didn't feel like it fully fit in the film. But overall, I enjoyed it. I thought they did a good job. I've been back and forth on if I was going to give it a 7.5 or 8, but I think I'm going to give an 8 to it just because of how good Emily Blunt and Dwayne Johnson is in this movie. Like, it's a pretty basic kind of story that they go through with, you get some gut punch, but it never gets into that really dramatic, hard hitting stuff, but it gets emotional. It could have just done a few things better, and it probably could have been much higher for me on that if they just tweaked a few things with the film.
Yeah, I landed on a 7.5 myself, just based on, like I said, they do a good job of highlighting this. This isn't like the most in-depth story because it is such a short period of time that you're covering, and they cover a lot in the short period of time that they do. But like you said, great performances at the top all around. There's not a ton of extra fluff that's thrown in here that's necessarily needed. It's a good look at a fighter's addiction, and it's a well-told UFC story here that's not really UFC, but it's more focused on the Pride organization. But those are kind of one and the same now. But it was really well done. The Rock is easily in his best acting role in this. I could see him being in the consideration for some awards here too. But 7.5, I think, is a fair a fair grading for this for me, and I can see why you would give it an 8 as well, because I was kind of on the fence to it, but I'm gonna lean on a 7.5, but because I wasn't extremely blown away by the film, but it's a good movie.
It was right on the cusp of really blowing you away with stuff, but it just kind of left some things hanging a little bit that just didn't hit that emotional weight that it could have had.
Yeah, and if you nailed it as well, the weird way that it ended, just a cold cut to Mark Kerr after the ending here, where it's just him just walking around a supermarket for like 2 or 3 minutes and checking out and going to his car, and just like gives this awkward wave to the camera like, thanks guys, bye. It was just really weird and didn't feel like it fit in that film. Like if they could have just cut it at the end with you know, The Rock's character here just like cutting off at that point, I think would have been fine. It was a little jarring, I'm not gonna lie.
That almost made me go from an 8 down to 7.5, but I'm like, the performances were enough for me to give, and my enjoyment over it overall was enough to give an 8, but 7.5 was very close to where I was, and yet that ending was just so weird to end it that way.
Yeah, it's still a really solid movie. Definitely one worth checking out if you're a fan of MMA. This is one you're definitely going to want to see. If you're kind of curious about MMA and you haven't really watched too much of it, I think it's still a really solid movie for you to check out. That kind of talks about some of the grittier early days of, you know, the pioneers of the UFC here a little bit, with, you know, Mark Coleman being one of the central, more popular of the what you would call OG MMA fighters. Like he's one of the more significantly popular ones. Like Mark Coleman is out here, you know, still being talked about to this day as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Like he's definitely in that conversation. So you get to see a little bit of a backstory for those guys, and it was really well done, and one that I could see myself going back and watching again at some point. But it was still a really solid movie. If you're ever interested in some of the origins of MMA and like how they talk about it here, this is a film for you for sure.
Yeah, so The Smashing Machine is in theaters now. Go check it out. Let us know what you think of it. But this is, you know, the best that Dwayne Johnson has acted and done, and I am really looking forward to see what he decides to do next, because he said after doing this experience was, you know, I'm doing more stuff for me now and different things that's going to challenge me, instead of worrying about just cranking out blockbuster after blockbuster to make movies, because, you know, a majority of his movies they've been fun, but they've just been, all right, just crank out another action movie, because he's like losing significant weight now to do another film with the director here where he's playing a 70-year-old man, so he's slimming down significantly to do it. So he's willing to change his physique, not only to bulk up, but now to finally like slim down, and it's going to be really interesting to see how he takes on playing in what sounds like a more quirky film after doing this one.
Yeah, I like him taking on passion projects now, because if you know anything about The Rock's not wanting for anything anymore, really. Like, he's made a ton of money. He's a very wealthy man, like very successful in almost all avenues of business and life that he's done, and now he can kind of focus on some more passion projects. I'm here for it. Let's see what else he wants to dive into and have some fun as an actor. I'm here for it. If he wants to take more risks, let's see it. I'm excited to see what he does next. But yeah, if you've seen him lately, the slim down is crazy. If you see this movie versus like a current photo of him, is wild. The stark contrast in his physique is crazy.
Do you forget how kind of smallish he was when he started wrestling? Like at first he was still a big guy, but compared to where his physique has been in the last 15 years or so, like he was significantly smaller then. So to see him for 15, 20 years being such a big, bulky, hulking guy to being a much slimmer guy, it was shocking to everybody. They're still talking about his appearance because of how shocking it was. Wondering if he was sick, if there was something wrong with him. But he says it was for a movie. But it's that shocking to see how small he's gotten. He's still big, but significantly smaller.
Yeah, relative to who he has been and who he's going to be, for sure. To find all of the episodes of We'll Bring the Popcorn, go to our YouTube page, hit the like and subscription button so you're getting our episodes when they drop each and every Monday. If you're listening to us in the audio realm on any of the podcasting platforms that we're on, please don't forget to give us a 5-star review. It really helps elevate the profile of the show. And don't forget to go to willbringthepopcorn.com, where it has all of our archive videos, all of our social media information, as well as our merch store, so you continue to support the show in that way. We cannot thank you enough for your continued support.